I'd like to say a very warm welcome to Gez Medinger to join us this afternoon. Gez has done an absolutely incredible amount of work since contracting COVID himself. Previously, both in the medical profession and also film director and athlete, and people may know his story, but I think I'd like to start by inviting you, Gez, to tell us a little bit about your story, and then we'll move into a discussion about long COVID.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll get through my story fairly quickly. I am now 44 years old. I was 41 years old when I got COVID. And until that point, I'd led a very busy life. I'd run a production company, film production company for 20 years. I was very much into my sports. Before that, I'd been a professional ski guide. I played amateur football for 15 years. I was also a runner as well. I did cross-country running at school. And then later in my mid-30s, I got into sort of competitive running again and ended up doing 3 marathons. And at the point in time at which I was, March 20, when I caught COVID, I was just at the peak of my training block for the London Marathon, which would have been in the April. And I was aiming for 2 hours 50. And all of my training was absolutely bang on. And then I got COVID, and I have not run for 2.5 years, bar a stupid month in the immediate aftermath where I thought I could just jog very carefully. Turns out that was a very bad idea. So I caught COVID, realized I wasn't getting better, and then noticed a very particular feeling, which was, I used to call it a grizzled feeling in my throat and sort of chest, from 20 years earlier, because at university I'd had what ultimately turned out to be glandular fever, and then a year of post-glandular fever, post-viral fatigue, which no doctors at the time, it was the 4th doctor I saw who finally clocked it, because I was wrecked, absolutely wrecked for a year. And that feeling was a signature feeling of that post-viral fatigue. And so when I felt that post-COVID, I thought, oh shit, hope I'm not in for another year of this. So I thought I would make a film looking at the science that linked what we knew about COVID to what we knew about post-viral fatigue. And I put that on my YouTube channel. And I wasn't, because I thought maybe there's lots of other people like me who have had COVID, because everybody got it in March 2020, especially in London. And maybe there's a lot of other people like me who are not getting better, because at the time, the narrative was, well, you die or you're ill for a week. And there was nothing else. Turns out, yes, hundreds of thousands of other people weren't getting better. And that was a bit of a start. We're sort of disappearing down the rabbit hole a little bit like Alice. And I've now made over 80 films about long COVID. I've done a lot of my own patient-led research. And I've just written the Long Covid Handbook, which will be released by Penguin on the 20th of October. So in just over a month.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We will touch on the handbook later on. One of the reasons for inviting you, and I think one of the things that's been so unique about your approach to all this, is that you really have become the kind of channel for a patient voice about what the reality is living with this condition. Could you just say a tiny bit about your whole kind of methodology? Because it's different to a kind of medical scientist research one in that sense. It's got more of a kind of social science research approach to it.
Yeah, so I realized fairly early on that I had an audience of people who were very interested in the research I was doing. At this point in time, it was just looking at papers and trying to link it all together and piecing it together and presenting back to people what I thought was going on. But then once that audience grew to a certain point, I realized that I had an opportunity to actually use that audience to gather data, which nobody else was doing. Because as a community, we had all of these questions about what the hell was going on. And this is April 2020. So, I mean, practically no GPs in the country were going, oh, long COVID's a thing. Long COVID didn't even have a name yet. It was just a bunch of people who were really ill and didn't know why. And there were lots of ideas floating around, lots of theories floating around. And so what I could do very easily was to put out surveys and get N numbers of the hundreds or even thousands within a matter of days. And actually inside that data was huge amounts of insights, which have subsequently been, confirmed by published papers 2 years later. But I was sort of finding this stuff out 2 years ago. And there is obviously a limit to the sort of stuff you can find from a survey. It has to be things that people already know, for example. So an interesting one I did was look into pre-existing conditions to look for what could be risk factors for long COVID. So something like that is the sort of thing that you can dig into quite well, or indeed antibody test results. So I've discovered that people's were far more likely to be testing negative on those early antibody tests if they were suffering from long COVID than people who'd cleared the virus quickly, or indeed had asymptomatic infections, who were much more likely to test positive in antibody tests. So that suggests to us that there's something different going on in the immune response in people who have long COVID. But what was happening to these people was they were just going to their doctors, over there in America especially, testing negative in antibody tests. You never had COVID, there's nothing wrong with you, it's anxiety. The reality is, yes, you did have COVID, you now have a post-viral condition, and your immune system is all out of whack. That's the reality. So for people to be able to see that of this community of long haulers, only 22% were testing positive for antibodies was incredibly validating, because it's not just me, this is a thing, this is real. And then again, 2 years later, we get papers showing the immune response is different and antibody levels are lower, etc. And like with the pre-existing conditions, I could look at other autoimmune conditions or immune-related conditions to see where there might be links. So diabetes doesn't seem to be linked. Rheumatoid arthritis, 15 times more prevalent in a long COVID community than the general population. Atopy, so that's hay fever, asthma, eczema, 2.5 times more prevalent in a long COVID population. Prior post-viral fatigue, 25 times more prevalent in a long COVID community. So there's all sorts of things we can start to get a picture about who's at risk of long COVID, and then also things like sex as well. So women, about 70-30, the sex split, sex distribution. And again, age, so tending to be early to middle age. Activity levels, people very active beforehand. This is not, these weren't all bedbound people beforehand. I think it was something like only 3% of my cohorts were inactive before getting COVID. 97% were active, and of those, 2/3 exercising vigorously at least 3 times a week. So, something's going on here. And I found with this audience, it gave me an incredible opportunity, but also responsibility, I felt, to use the position I found myself in to try and find out what was going on to some degree and answer some of the questions that the community had that could be asked in this manner. Now, there's a limit. I can't find out about whether people have got, I can't do tests on people. So there's a limit to the kind of research I can do. But at the same time, there was a lot of very powerful evidence that I could sort of dig out through this. And this is where actually my prior degree might be in engineering, but it gave me a sense of academic rigor, which I could apply to this setting.
Yeah, and it's that data, it's the kind of numbers of responses that you've had to things that I think have been so validating and actually really kind of impacted the amount of discussion that there is, because yes, people weren't kind of, the general sort of dismissiveness of some medics was clearly no longer valid. In terms of, we're all kind of very excited that COVID produced the opportunity for there to be some investment in research, which for those people living with not only long COVID, but for those people who've also got ME/CFS in particular, and possibly fibromyalgia, we're very excited to see whether any of this could generate any research which could give any clues or anything about any of these other conditions too. In terms of the current science and research around long COVID, what would you rate as being the most kind of promising avenues of inquiry?
So it's a big topic, this. I will just start off by referring to the connective tissue disorders that have long been associated with ME/CFS. I'm actually about to do, I've been talking to a consultant called Philip Bull, and we've sort of generated some questions. So in my next follow-up survey of the first wave long haulers, which will be I've done it every 6 months, so 6, 12, 18, 24 months. And we're just, now with September, we're hitting 30 months, so 2.5 years. And I'll be including a section there to ask about connective tissue disorders to see if we have any correlation in long COVID with those as well, because that would also be another interesting sort of piece of a jigsaw puzzle. But on to the main question, what's the most promising science at the moment? So as an overview, since relatively early in sort of the recognition of long COVID, there was sort of 5 possible theories about what might be causing it. And just to run through them, we've got so direct tissue damage from the virus, autoimmunity, and then immune dysregulation. viral persistence and viral debris. We've added 2 more recently, which are disruption of the microbiome and reactivation of latent viruses. So these are our overarching possible causes. Now, my suspicion is we're not going to find that just one of them is responsible. I think we're going to find that everybody's a little bit different, but there's perhaps 2 or 3 of these which are common to most long haulers. And underneath that, we've got the pathologies of what's been identified. So we've got the various different clotting pathologies. So there's the relatively well-known paper by Rezia Pretorius and Doug Kell that found microclots. That hasn't been reproduced elsewhere yet, but it does seem that, and we know that COVID's a vascular condition. So clotting does seem that it's part of the puzzle, but again, we've got to do some more work on that. Then we've got metabolic dysfunction, mitochondrial dysfunction. This is a subject very closely shared with ME/CFS. MCAS is huge in long COVID. Dysautonomia is a major factor. We've also got hypoperfusion that seems to be going on, and that's probably connected to the microclotting and hypoperfusion of brain tissue, of every organ, it seems. And then recently from...
What that is?
Oh, sorry. Oxygen. Oxygen isn't getting to the tissues. We're not getting enough oxygen to the tissues. And then Akiko Iwasaki and David Petrino recently had a paper published which found that cortisol levels were the most direct, what's the word I'm looking for, obvious marker that held up across the long COVID people versus the controls. And it showed that they were basically running about half the level of cortisol. And this doesn't seem to the controls. So there's low cortisol levels for some reason. Is this exhausted adrenals? Is it something else? Certainly would explain why a bunch of us feel better on steroids and prednisolone. So there's a lot of these avenues. There's so many avenues to want to dig into. I feel that viral persistence is probably the one that needs the most pressing research. There's an organization that's recently been set up called the Long COVID Research Initiative, and they've done a great job. And I know one of the guys who's been involved in doing it. And they've now got a investment from a guy called Vitalik Buterin, who's a big cryptocurrency guy, but he's put 15 million in, and they're going to be looking directly into viral persistence. You might think, so Polybio are the team looking into that in America, and Dr. Amy Prowell is one of the leaders on that. And you might think that if it's viral persistence, well, maybe this is somewhere where long COVID would differ from ME/CFS. I'm not so sure about that. I think we've discovered there's enough research out there already showing that enteroviruses are hanging around in the guts in people who've got ME/CFS. We may find something very similar is happening with COVID and with the spike protein generally. And what we might have is different viruses causing the same consequences in the body. So yes, there may be some differences there, but fundamentally the reason why these conditions may look so similar is there is some degree of viral persistence, which is driving autoimmunity, which is driving immune dysregulation, which is driving disruption of the microbiome, reactivating EBV and all sorts of other stuff, and then all the consequential downstream pathologies, including, the clotting, including the MCAS, including the dysautonomia. So it's such a complex world. There's a reason why ME/CFS is so poorly understood by the majority of the clinical and medical and academic profession, and it's because it's bloody complicated. There is no simple answer to it, and it hasn't been cracked yet. And I think the same applies to long COVID. The good thing right now is that we've got more attention, more eyeballs, more dollars being fired at this problem than ever before. And whilst it will take some time, I do believe that the point in time at which we crack long COVID, we will probably crack ME/CFS too. So long answer to your question. I hope it broadly answered it.
Yes, no, thank you. And yes, and the urgency is incredible. I was reading that I think the prevalence of long COVID in the US is now 24 and plus million. I think the incidence in the UK is about 500,000 now, people living long term with it.
So 430,000 for over 2 years, 2 million with long COVID for more than 6 weeks. So anybody who's been ill for more than 6 weeks, that's 2 million in the UK, but 430,000 for over 2 years.
Which has a massive impact on people's ability to work and study and everything. So there's economic issues.
Monumentally. These are people in the prime of their working lives. I haven't done a single day of my old profession in 2.5 years because I can't go and do a 14-hour day. it will just destroy me. I could maybe just about get through it, but I couldn't do another day's work after it, that's for sure.
Do it on the next day. Yeah, that's the key thing, isn't it? So, okay. And just very, very briefly, the plotting issue is really interesting. We are hoping, but we haven't finalized it yet, to have a talk on early December, including Professor Caroline Dalton, who's a local expert who is actually doing some of the testing locally. So we're going to be following that line of inquiry. So there's, I mean, you will have experienced the stigma and disbelief attached to having this sort of invisible illness, and also to that you will have been told that you were suffering from anxiety, as I think everybody who's here today has probably been told at some point in their life. And maybe we do have anxiety, but that's probably to
secondary or tertiary.
Long-term illness. Exactly. Do you have any, or have you learned any tips along the way about handling disbelieving medics?
Get a new one.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only so much that you can do. The change, it's very difficult to force that change as a patient. I think where it's going, someone's just said links to papers mentioned. Oh, okay. I don't know if that was about I can only read half the comments in the chat there as it's popped up. I was saying, one of the things you can do, and some GPs are prepared to read papers that you send them. That's not all of them. Not all of them are that open-minded to go, what I thought was the medical landscape as I understood it. Oh, look, the patient sent me something. I'm now going to change my opinion on this. I don't know how many do that. The change has to kind of come from the top. At the point in time at which we start getting large studies like the Recover Initiative, which the Americans are spending $1 billion on, and it's going to be like a 5-year longitudinal study. I hope they're getting the methodology right. I hope they're looking at the right stuff, because there was one dire study that came out of the American system recently as well that tried to say it was all in everyone's heads. But assuming that they actually do that properly and actually find something clinically useful for doctors in there, and that gets published in Nature or Science or JAMA or something, then that might start to change stuff, right? Because that will start to make waves. At the point in time at which big journals start publishing papers that have something physical that can basically register with clinicians that they can actually do and practice, I think we might start to see some changes in behaviors. Until then, if you've got a medic who's not helping you, a GP who's not helping you, you can try sending them some links to papers. You can try all the right things, but if they don't want to, I don't know how you persuade them. Do you know what I mean? That you don't have the time to do so. They don't have the time to listen. So in theory, at the moment, there is supposedly now in every GP practice in Britain, there's supposed to be one doctor who's now familiar with long COVID. Supposed to be. So you ought to be able to call up and ask to speak to that doctor. And they ought to then be able to go, yes, I will prescribe you some fexofenadine and some famotidine. I'll prescribe you some H1 and H2, and that will calm down your allergy, your MCAS type symptoms. You've got POTS. Okay, I'm actually going to do a quick NASA lean test. And then I'll maybe give you some conservative recommendations. But maybe if those don't work, I'll give you midodrine or ivabradine or some beta blockers. You know, there are things that doctors can do, but the doctors need to be switched on, and they need to be able to be open-minded enough to go, okay, I can give you symptomatic relief. We may not have clinical indications for long COVID and what I can be prescribing for long COVID directly, but you've got headaches. So let me give you something that we know we can prescribe for headaches or whatever. So it's so hard. I actually have a chapter in the book on how to approach and how to get your GP to help you, which I wrote with the help of 2 GPs who've got long COVID in the UK and 1 in America. And there's a whole list of advice about how to prepare before the appointments, how to approach it during the appointments, how to manage, it's in some ways the ego of the doctor, so you don't just waltz in and go, I've got microclots, give me some drugs. You have to kind of feed them the ingredients for them to make their own conclusions, and just spoon feeding them in the right way so they feel like they've come to that conclusion, and then you're much more likely to get the care you want. But it's hard. It ultimately, you will always get much better care from a doctor that understands the complexity of the condition, whether it's ME/CFS or long COVID, and is prepared to be open-minded and helpful with the lines of treatment that you can prescribe for it, because you can manage symptoms to some degree. with stuff that you can prescribe on the NHS.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to move us on to this extraordinary word called pacing, which is takes me a nanosecond to say, and certainly is a skill that I think can take years to kind of really crack. It is incredibly easy to describe and incredibly difficult to do. You've certainly talked to patients a lot about pacing, the art and the science of pacing. What would you what are the kind of key messages that come forward for you?
So so I think one of the hardest things about pacing is the fact that it's not, as much as you can apply science to it, it's not a science, because what you might be able to do one day, you won't be able to do another day. And there is no rhyme or reason as to why the second day, not necessarily the day after, but the other day you do that amount will smash you to bits and the first one wouldn't, or vice versa. So yes, you can apply some science to it and you can say, I'm going to cap my activities at 0.55 of my maximum heart rate, which is one of the recommendations generally. And that's a good guide. But there are days when you might be able to do more of that. There might be days when you might be able to do less. And it's very difficult to know which they are. I mean, I think generally there are sort of three fundamental rules with pacing, the way I look at it. And the first one is do less. We can't live the lives we used to do. We have to understand that the sheer volume of stuff that you can do in a day is not the same anymore. You have to take breaks. Any job you try and do is going to be different for everyone, how long they can do whatever that job is, putting to take a break and how long that break is, but you will need to take breaks. You'll probably need to do whatever you're doing slower. So you can't basically wash the car at the same speed you used to, or you can't walk the kids to school at the same speed you used to, or you can't pack for a holiday at the same speed you used to, whatever it is. And that you might also, the other part of this after do slower is do differently. So maybe you might need to consider having a stool in the shower, because a shower is quite autonomically stressful, because A, you're standing up, B, you're raising your body temperature, C, you're moving around trying to do stuff, then you're bending over, then you're standing up again. And you might not have considered that having a shower was a challenging thing for your body to manage before, but actually, kind of autonomically it is. So having a shower stool, yeah, there you go. Do you need to fry an egg or do some cooking? Or maybe maybe you need a stool in the kitchen that you can just perch whilst you do that. When can you sit down whilst doing a thing as opposed to doing that thing standing up? So how can you modify these activities? How can you modify your travel? How can you look at, so for example, learning what your own difficulties are makes a big difference. So for example, my sister struggles hugely with visual processing. I struggle hugely with verbal processing. So I can manage an hour's driving better than I can manage an hour's Zoom call. For her, it's the other way around. For me, I would rather spend 2 hours driving than do an hour's public transport, because the walk, the going up the stairs, all the rest of it of doing that hours. So for me, I know that, okay, it might take longer doing this thing, but I can tolerate it better. So think about how you do all sorts of things, because actually sometimes it's not always doing it the fastest way that's best, because if that hits your particular weakness, so this is where it's an art form, and it's an art form that you have to learn. You have to learn your own body, and it takes years, right? It takes years and years, and a bunch of people on this chat will be able to do it far better than I can, because they've been doing it for far longer. I still crash. I don't know anybody with long COVID who has perfected the art of pacing, so they never crash. We all want to live some kind of life. We all want to maximize the amount of life we're capable of leading. And that means that we're always going to be testing the limits. And when those limits change without warning, well, sometimes I'll catch you out. So it's an art that can't be perfected, in my opinion. And the only science we've got really is, 0.55 your maximum heart rate. But yeah.
The heart rate thing is quite helpful. And certainly, when in my family, we revised, to find the baseline, which was this kind of mythical thing that, a year on, we still hadn't found the baseline. Because as you say, there isn't a kind of static baseline from which to kind of measure your increase and stuff. But I think the heart rate monitoring is certainly one way helping.
It's particularly useful when your heart, and I don't know how this is actually bit of a gap in my knowledge. I don't know how prevalent dysautonomia is amongst people with ME/CFS. I would assume quite.
Yeah.
It's certainly extremely
More
prevalent.
Yes.
Yeah, probably similar to long COVID then, which is the majority of people. So if you're dysautonomic, what's probably going to happen is your heart rate's going to spike when you do very little. So I was washing my car with my dad yesterday. He's 82. I'm, an ex-marathon runner. I mean, we're just literally going around doing this. I look down at my heart rate, 130. I'm like, I've got to sit down right now. Here's 65. So even doing trivial things can send your heart rate potty, and that's why being cognizant of it is so important. So I could see that and go, I need to sit down right now, and I need to breathe until I've got it back down to 80, which took 10 minutes.
So a big self-awareness exercise.
Yeah.
Self-monitoring. Okay. You've done a very, very fascinating piece of work recently about a topic that we really barely talk about. We sometimes talk about very, very little, about the impact on relationships and intimacy. I wonder whether you could share your findings with this group of people.
So
we clearly need to talk about it more and why it's important.
So maybe again, you can tell me if this is wrong, but as I was sort of doing this survey online, there were people from the ME/CFS community who were saying, 30 years, I've never seen any data collected on this subject in ME/CFS. And that seems absolutely potty to me, because it has such a massive impact on our quality of life, as well as our mental health and our emotional well-being and all of that. So, okay, so I'll very quickly run through my findings. So these were all long COVID people. The majority of them, 3/4 of them had long COVID for at least 18 months. 3/4 of them were in a relationship when they first developed long COVID. 1/4 of them were not. Of the people who were in a relationship, I asked them if their relationship had been affected by them suffering from long COVID. And obviously the answer is probably going to be yes. But the degree of yes here is the interesting thing. So half of the whole sample said that the relationship had been slightly negatively affected by the condition. Another 30% said it had been severely negatively affected. And of that, so we've got that's 80% saying their relationship's been negatively impacted by the illness versus 4% who'd said it had been improved. It kind of speaks for itself, really. I asked if the long hauler felt that their partner understood what they were going through. 4 answers to this. They do not understand at all. They understand a little. They understand most of the time. They completely understand. So 22% completely get it, which means that the other, sorry, my brain fog's, my mental arithmetic's gone down the pan here. 78% struggle with their partner not understanding what they're going through to some degree. And of that, 8% do not understand at all, and 25% only understand a little. So 1/3 of this total group really, really struggle with their partner only understanding a little or not at all of what they're going through. Are these people in a relationship, is their health and their consequential needs a source of conflict between them? 3/4 say yes, of which occasionally is half. So conflict is occasionally, the health is occasionally a source of conflict for half the time. And then another 1/4 is either frequently or all the time. I've got a lot of long form answers as well, but that'll take ages to go through. I also looked into dating for all the people who were single, and said, had long COVID impacted on their ability to start a new relationship? 90% of people either said they hadn't tried or hadn't been able to even think of doing it, or it had a large negative impact. The impact of how on earth do you try and go for dates when you're suffering with an energy limiting condition? You can't drink alcohol, probably. You can't, at what point do you broach it with this new person? You can't go out dancing. You can't, let alone finding the time for somebody else in your life where you're struggling to get through yourself. I also asked questions on sexual function and libido. These were also fairly striking. So 3/4 of the group were either slightly negatively impacted or severely negatively impacted in terms of libido. 7.5% no longer had any. Between males and females, I asked the question as well. I split up the answer separately. Both sexes generally affected kind of equally severely. Has long COVID affected people's ability to function sexually? And this is in a sort of a physical or biological sense. 70% say it's either slightly or severely negatively impacted their physical ability to function sexually, with a further 4% not able to function at all as a consequence of long COVID. So, and then I've got some questions about frequency of sexual activity, which is like basically never for everyone. It's how many people had to make modifications to their sexual activity in order to make it compatible with long COVID and avoid PEM? 2/3 say yes. So this touches every part of people's lives. And, we've all seen these sorts of symptom charts and the sort of the body for here are the symptoms and these are the systems that go wrong. But no one's really sort of spoken about the impact on relationships and your support networks, which is huge, let alone the physical sexual impact of this, again, which should be a good part of a healthy adult's life. So, and again, it just goes under the sort of the radar, but it's a hugely under talked about subject, and one that needs further research on from what I've been able to do, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I think what you've said will kind of no doubt sort of chime some bells with people. And yeah, how we love each other and express that seems to be an absolutely fundamental part of living, even without chronic illness, but certainly living with it, you need that love even more. You've recently written a handbook, and you've even recorded it, so it's an audio book. It's not out yet, but without doing too much of an advert, could you give us a flavour of the book and what it contains? And yeah, go for it.
So the idea of the book came to me when I realised that there was no single place, no singular resource to go to for people who are suffering with long COVID. Let's say that you catch Omicron now and you develop long COVID and you go, oh, I'm not right. Well, where the hell do you go? Where's the repository of information that tells people A, what's going on with them as far as we best know, and B, what they should do about it in order to give themselves the best chance of recovery or manage the condition. And you can just go and Google it, but God knows you'll come across all sorts of crackpot stuff out there on the internet. It sounds a bit grandiose, but it felt like the world desperately needed some singular resource that brought together everything that we'd learned from the last 2.5 years of long COVID, but also decades of MECFS before that. We're standing on the shoulders of giants here in the work that's gone on in the MECFS community. So I wrote it with Professor Danny Altmann, who's a professor of immunology at Imperial. And we cover between us sort of the clinical academic science on his part, and then the patient side from my part. And there's a lot of very interesting stuff that Danny can talk about, but equally, when it comes to talking about pacing and crashing, there's only so much that Danny can talk about, but I can talk to that, in detail. So it's, I'll run you very quickly through the chapter list. I think I've got it underneath here. Here we go, which will give you an idea of the kinds of topics we're sort of trying to cover. There are 13 chapters. So the first 2 chapters are what is long COVID and who gets long COVID and why. We've got a whole chapter 3 on can children get long COVID and what should parents do if they've got a child who's suffering from long COVID. I imagine the advice is going to be very similar for parents of children with ME. We've got 2 chapters on what I think is the most comprehensive breakdown anywhere that will have been published to date on what might be causing long COVID, breaking down each of those 7 causes I mentioned earlier and looking at the evidence for and against them, and then looking at all of the published evidence we've got for all of the various pathologies going on in long COVID. We've got a chapter on gender bias and how to tackle it, because most sufferers are women, and women face extra challenges when trying to access care. And so we wanted to address that. We've spoken to a few a few experts on that subject for that chapter, because obviously there's only so much I can talk about from my experience as a man. We have a whole chapter on mental health and the impact of long COVID on mental health and coping mechanisms, because I don't know anybody who's had it for more than a year who hasn't described the most incredible depths it sends you to when it strips you of all of your faculties, you know, and your ability to maintain relationships, and everything that you hold dear to you is compromised. You know, it's going to have a secondary impact on mental health. It's not, the condition doesn't derive from mental health, as some doctors would like to believe. Then we've got a chapter on how to help others help you. So this is GPs and others in your support network. We've got a whole chapter on tips for managing symptoms. So this is all of the behavioral adaptations that you can do, like pacing, for example. Got a whole chapter on treatments, pharmacological treatments and holistic treatments and what we know about them. And then we've got a couple of chapters on recovery and the emotional journey, because that's also really significant. So yeah, that's hopefully what's in the book. I've tried to keep it as absolutely up to the minute date as we can be with it, and very, very excited to see it finally get published.
That's going to be an incredibly useful resource, and really, really grateful to you for capturing everything that you've covered in the journey so far and putting it in one succinct place. And that will be really helpful. Also very helpful that it's an audio book. That makes it a huge amount easier for everybody. I've got a couple of things I particularly wanted to pick out, which have come up in the chat. One is, does the book, or can you comment at all on anything around diet, managing diet, metabolism, any of those related issues?
One, generally speaking, there wasn't a lot of conflict in writing the book between me and Danny. But one of the areas where there was conflict was on the subject of diet, because low histamine diets there is evidence out there for them, but generally speaking, if you go and speak to a group of immunologists and the rest of it, they'll all be like, no evidence for that. The reality of what we see on the ground and hear on the ground, and certainly my own personal experience, is that a low histamine diet for me, absolutely critical. So again, if you are displaying symptoms of MCAS, or you previously had any history of atopy, you would be well advised to try it and see if some of your symptoms abate. When it comes to metabolic sort of support, I did so I spoke to a South African doctor called Adrian Wenzel, who published a paper arguing that NAD+ deficiency may be playing some role in long COVID. And he recommended that you're on mute. What is NAD? It's a critical coenzyme necessary for the production of ATP, which is our body's unit of energy. So if you're short of NAD+, then your body is short of energy, full stop, not just to go running about, but to power your organs' basic biological processes. And one of the things you need to make NAD+ is nicotinic acid. And because of a metabolic shift between two different pathways, it basically means that we're running out of that. So supplementing your diet with vitamin B3, which is nicotinic acid, can be beneficial. I did a study which showed that it did seem to be beneficial with a P number of 0.01. Again, there's all sorts of, you can shoot holes in my studies. They are essentially quick and dirty. But anecdotally and through my data, it did seem that niacin helped people. Amino acids are another thing that you could do to support metabolically. There is some, I don't know if I've seen any data for helpfulness of that, but certainly theoretically it would help with some of the mitochondrial dysfunction that we're seeing, and the way that the mitochondria may be malfunctioning in ME/CFS and long COVID. So yeah, that's diet and metabolism in a nutshell.
And I would encourage people here to look on our sheffieldmegroup.co.uk website. We did a talk with Professor Carding from Norwich, which was about the gut biome. That was incredibly informative, and also kind of explored this whole thing about fecal transplants as well, and their relevance to looking at ways of treating ME/CFS.
So on that front, very quickly, there has only been one RCT published for long COVID, and it's on probiotics. There's a probiotic, I've got it behind my desk here, called Phyto-V. There we go. Phyto-V and Your Gut Plus. And that RCT demonstrated that it was helpful for people with long COVID. And I would imagine by association, probably MECFS2. So yeah, look that up if that's of interest.
And yes, Professor Carding, he particularly recommended, I've lost the name for it, the what's the milk-based product?
Lactose?
No.
Cream. Yogurt.
Come back.
Sorry.
The fermented one, fermented yogurt. Kefir.
Kefir. Yeah.
Thank you, Katrina.
So again, so kefir is great for your gut microbiome, but some people won't tolerate it who have got severe MCAS because it's fermented. So you're always in this sort of yeah.
Okay, lovely. Yeah. So we're not taking questions from the floor. So Keith, I wonder whether you could pop your question in the chat. That would be really helpful. Right, we had a number of questions sent to us in advance, which I've shared with Gez, and he's promised to do the high-speed version of answers to them. So if you put your seatbelts on, he will run through those.
Yeah.
But they will be quite quick. If you watch YouTube later, you can do it at slower speed. But,
yeah, here we go. So question number 1, how likely is it that living with long COVID will impact future health negatively? Well, right now we don't have any data on this. The only thing we can do is look at people who have had MECFS for a long time or people who had SARS-1. SARS-1 people are not necessarily well now, but it was a different virus. It was much more severe. A lot of them had organ damage, and they're still suffering the effects of that organ damage sort of 18 years later. MECFS, yeah, you can maybe add about this long things of that, but basically we don't know, unfortunately, at the moment. Question number 2, is any effective treatment available on the NHS for people with long COVID? I mentioned this briefly earlier. H1, H2 antihistamines from a sympathetic GP. Also that you can get medications for POTS, and which may also help with generic dysautonomia as well. So yes, you can. If you're particularly POTSy, it's definitely worth seeing your GP. If you're particularly MCASy, it's particularly worth seeing your GP and trying to get some antihistamines, but you may have to try more than one GP before you'll find one who goes, yes, this is fine. Question number 3, do you find the current advice for patients to pace activities helpful for long COVID? I would say it is the single most important thing that anybody with long COVID can do. So yes. Question number 4, are people with post-COVID illness being assessed for MECFS within a few weeks rather than long COVID? No, it seems to me that doctors are tending to say this is long COVID rather than MECFS at the moment. What we're seeing with some people who've had long COVID for more than a year is some of them are going and some of them want to get a diagnosis of MECFS because it might help them with their work situation or other issues. I think certainly a lot of people with long COVID would qualify for a diagnosis of MECFS. But right now, doctors are tending to call it long COVID if you've got post-COVID illness, i.e. it's in the first few months. Question number 5, what proportion of those who catch COVID go on to qualify for a diagnosis of MECFS? Oh, same thing, most. Anybody with post-exertional malaise, which is the vast majority. Next question. Interested in the most effective use of antihistamines in relation to MCAS and in particular nighttime heart palpitations. So I made a film with Dr. Boon Lim, who's a cardiologist recently, and he spoke about this and how he thinks that these nighttime heart palpitations that wake you up with your heart racing may well be due to mast cell degranulation during the night. So taking an evening antihistamine before you go to bed may well help. Now, you may need to try a few different antihistamines because everybody reacts a little bit differently to each. So keep trying different ones until you find one that helps, is the general rule for that. Next question, what can employers do to help employees who are suffering from long COVID? Well, the answer is a huge amount, but the first thing I would say would be to understand that they are going to have to pace their working environment. They're going to have to probably need to work from home. They're going to need to have limited work hours during the day. They're going to need to have limited time on Zoom calls, for example, and lots of understanding about how much can be expected of them and that it's not always going to be the same. And there's going to be some days where they just need to take complete time out, and that's going to have to be okay, rather than you can't. So a huge amount of flexibility and understanding. Fundamentally, not all employers will have that. Someone says, I'm interested to know how he felt when he felt able to do more activities such as getting back to winter sports. So I made a film in February, which is a little bit controversial because I went out to the Alps and went skiing. And this all sounds incredibly dramatic and incredibly hardcore, and wow, I must be better. No. Travel was difficult, but I got out there and I made it my focus to basically dedicate all the time that I wasn't trying to ski to rest, breath work, meditation. No work, no stress, no phone calls, none of that. And I was doing 8 to 10 hours throughout the whole of the rest of the day of just all of that stuff to calm the autonomic system down and just to rest. When I was on the mountain, I was just simply standing up, sliding for 20 seconds, stopping for a minute or two, breathing, calming the heart rate down, doing it again, 20 seconds, stop. Every single lift, I wouldn't take part in conversation. I'd just sit there and do my breathing exercises. And I'd only be on the mountain for an hour and then I came off. Like that, it was doable. Doing it any other way, not doable. How did I know I was ready for that? I just took a punt. I had a sense and I took a punt. What blood tests can I ask my GP for that might show blood clotting abnormalities? None, unfortunately, in this country. You would need to do some fluorescence microscopy, and that's only going to happen in Mulheim in Germany at the moment. Although I think some places in South Africa might be setting it up, and it's supposed to be a few places possibly setting it up here. But right now, if you go into your doctor and say, I think I've got blood clotting anomalies, they're going to say, okay, we'll do all the normal tests. Oh, they're normal. You could ask for a test for antiphospholipid antibodies because they can cause clotting pathology, but they are obviously not present in everyone. Although it does seem that they are more common in long COVID than the population generally. Yes, please tell us more about your MCAS theory. Totally makes sense. Every long COVID symptom can be tied back to mast cell dysfunction. Such a huge topic. Watch my film with Lawrence Afrin on YouTube. We spend an hour talking about that in detail. Why are we seeing so many people who were uber active being disproportionately affected by long COVID? Is it mitochondrial malfunction? No, my theory on this is that I think it's autonomic stress. So I think people who were disproportionately active before were carrying a huge amount of physiological stress in their systems. So basically they've been I certainly had, I've been razzing myself into the red for ages. And you get away with razzing yourself into the red for ages most of the time until a virus comes along and hey presto, you get knocked over the edge, out of the red and into the splat territory. And my theory is that it's autonomic as opposed to mitochondrial. Yes, there may well be mitochondrial dysfunction afterwards, but the primary thing that connects the prior activity with the risk of getting long COVID, I think, is autonomic. And I think people who razz themselves to the max for too long over too many years are the ones who are more likely to find themselves in a dysautonomic state as a result of a COVID infection. Another question, what kept him going? No choice. You just do. I had some really rough weeks writing the book, really rough, where the stress of having to hit a deadline made my long COVID worse, my cognitive dysfunction worse, which meant it was even harder to write, which meant that I couldn't do it and I got even more stressed and vicious loops from hell. I don't know. I really, really struggled. It wasn't easy, but no choice, I guess. And I'm just trying to avoid crashing by just trying to be as disciplined as possible about pacing. What do I think has made the biggest improvements to the largest group of people? So the only data I've got on that is from my surveys is low histamine diet and niacin. There may well be other things that help hugely as well, but that's all I've got data for. Yeah, next question. Are people finding that relapses, crashes are a common occurrence even years after infection affecting cognitive abilities again? Well, relapses and crashes are common. They are almost the defining attribute, I would say, of long COVID and to some degree ME/CFS, even years after. There was a study recently that looked at people's recovery and found that 33% of them who felt they'd recovered subsequently had a relapse of symptoms at some point. So yeah, happens all the time. Have I looked into hyperbaric oxygen treatment at all? My views on rivaroxaban for hypercoagulability. Yes, HBOT is really good, makes you feel really good, but most people tend to slip back to where they were before once they stop doing it. If you can afford to keep doing it all the time, great, but not many of us can. It does, however, suggest that something oxygen tissue delivery related is going on that's a bit funky. The fact that HBOT helps as much as it does. Rivaroxaban will probably help symptoms. There's a preprint showing that sort of what they're calling triple therapy, so clopidogrel, apixaban, and aspirin, so antiplatelets and a DOAC are helping symptoms. Same thing would probably apply to rivaroxaban. But again, there are risks with all anticoagulants. Last question here. How can I access testing for microclots when GP Long Covid clinic isn't aware such a thing exists? Go to Mulheim. If you want to have a test done, go to Mulheim. You can't. There's nothing here yet. Part of the problem is that the results from that paper that found it haven't been replicated elsewhere yet. And we haven't got haematologists in the UK having any kind of consensus on what they think the structures are that are being argued to be microclots, or where they fit in the causality chain. So it's really hard. We need to have more studies replicating those results, and then we may start to see places popping up and Long Covid clinics recognizing it as a problem.
That is something that I'm pleased to say is being pursued in Sheffield, but I would also say it's at a very early stage. As you say, those studies have not been replicated yet.
Yeah.
But actually, what's being found is even when you treat the microclots, they return. This is not a cure. Please do not hang on to it as a cure. It is absolutely not a cure. And in the same way that HBOT does help people for a very short amount of time. So if you're needing a kind of, a good day for some planned reason, that may be one thing, but it's not something that's going to make people feel long-term any better. So, but yeah, it could be useful short-term. Right, I'm very aware that many people here are living with long COVID, ME/CFS, fibromyalgia, etc., and we're just coming up to an hour. So I'm fairly keen to stop where we are at the moment. But perhaps what I'll do is we'll allow Gez to go. We'll just leave the chat open for another few minutes. If people want to pose specific questions, we're happy to pass them on to Gez for him to respond to by email. But I kind of sense that we should close it now, because that's only fair.
Well, you know what? If there's any questions in the chat, I can see if I can answer them now. Because to be honest, it's easier for me to answer them now than get my brain around an email later. So, okay. Yeah. Do you want? Shall I go through the chat or?
Yes, by all means, go through the chat. Meanwhile, I just want to say an absolutely enormous thank you to you for both sharing your time with us today, but also for all the work that you've managed to get through, despite how rubbish you must have been feeling for the last 2.5 years.
It's been grim.
It's really, we know, I think we know. And it's just hugely appreciated. And it's this powerful thing of actually talking by numbers and data that has been such a special contribution to the discussion, and so much appreciated, because it's so validating, both for people with long COVID and ME/CFS. And there are people here today who I know who've actually got both. If you get COVID on top of ME/CFS, some people have actually gone on to have a whole complicated set of ongoing symptoms. So yeah, thank you to everybody who's joined us today. And I know people have come from far and wide. It's been great. We've had new people who have not met before, and we really appreciate it. So we will be putting this recording onto our YouTube channel in the next day or two, but also sharing with Gez for him to put on his YouTube channel, which I would thoroughly recommend people go to, because there's an incredible amount of very, very valuable and important information there, which is really useful to all of us. Even if we've not got long COVID, it's still really helpful. So big thank you very much to everybody, and special thank you to you, Gez. So if we just leave it on for another couple of minutes. Bear in mind that Gez can't prescribe quantities or amounts of things.
No,
all sorts of stuff. So, but he knows how to manage all.
Yeah. So people asking about EBV reactivations. Yeah, it does seem to happen quite a bit. I kind of fancy that the grizzled feeling I felt in my throat early doors was an EBV reactivation in long COVID, but it went away. All that's going to be doing is just turbocharging the long COVID. Again, we don't know too much about the mechanism yet because we don't really understand the mechanism of EBV post-viral fatigue in the first place. There's another one here. Are people actually recovering? The answer is yes, they are. But of the first waivers, of which I am one, I would say people are recovering, but it's a trickle, not a flood. But for each one who recovers randomly at 2 years or 2.5 years, that should give us hope to all of us that it's not like, you know, the body is capable of resolving whatever the hell is going on. And that, you know, one of the really weird and difficult things about this is that I kind of feel that you have to accept your condition to a degree and not fight it and not be angry with it and not be bitter about it and not do all of this, because you have to try and let the body be as calm as possible, right? So you have to accept your position, but at the same time, you don't want to accept your condition because you always want to hold this hope of recovery. So there's one dichotomy there. The other one is, well, we don't want to obsess over our symptoms because, again, you get caught in this vicious loop. But at the same time, you have to be aware enough of your body that you go, I'm just starting to overdo it because I've just had that first bit of head pressure here that tells me I'm just overdoing it. So you have to be hyper aware, but you don't want to be hyper vigilant. Tell me how you work that one out. So there's all of these horrible contradictions in managing the condition that just make the whole thing so hard. So yes, people are recovering. That's an answer to this one. There was another one a bit further down here. Sorry, excuse me, I'm just scrolling through. Any links with neurological conditions such as Parkinson's with LC? No strong data yet. It's too early. We may find in years to come that there are, but right now we just don't know. I'm left with 24/7 head and face pain. Is that common or usual with long COVID? Sorry. Someone is saying, I'm just left with 24/7 head and face pain. Is that common or usual with long COVID? Sorry, I promise I do speak slower than this in the book, on the audio book. I would say that's uncommon, but not unheard of. Neurological symptoms, including pain, are definitely one of the recognized symptoms of long COVID. Lots of people saying thank you. Well, thank you too. I'm glad you appreciate the work I do. Are the NICE guidelines for long COVID being produced or updated? Do they contain the recommendations you've made today? So I don't know if they're being produced or updated. I very much doubt they contain the recommendations I'm giving, because until you've got massive RCTs showing the efficacy of low histamine diets and niacin, they're not going to. Only GPs are, I guess, more likely to respond to a NICE guideline. Yeah, exactly. But it's going to how long did it take us to get graded exercise therapy removed from the ME/CFS NICE guidelines? Decades. So don't hold your breath on NICE guidelines being particularly helpful for long COVID, I'm afraid. Any specific steps or supplements to help with long COVID brain fog? Again, really hard one. One of the symptoms that was particularly helped by niacin was brain fog, so might be worth trying that. Again, with niacin, look at the contraindications on the BNF website. It does cause a flushing effect, so be very careful how much you take. Start off on a low dose, take it after a meal, and consider a low dose aspirin at the same time to mitigate the flushing effect. I'm not a doctor. These are not medical advice. What else have we got here? How can the profile of long COVID be improved to help understanding? Please comment regarding T-cell exhaustion theory. How can the profile of long COVID be improved to help understanding? Well, the book hopefully will do a little bit of that, right? But understanding requires, at the moment, reading 50 different research papers which aren't particularly accessible and trying to make your own sense of your own version of a jigsaw puzzle. Everybody's got their own. Imagine like you've got a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and there's 250 random pieces just all over the floor, and different people are organizing them in different shapes and going, that's what I think the shape is. Someone else organizes them in a different thing. Someone else says, I don't even see, that's not even a jigsaw puzzle, and hoovers it all up. So, you know, it's how do we improve understanding? Huge studies, well recognized, published in major journals, picked up by media, will take ages, unfortunately. Please comment regarding T-cell exhaustion theory. My only comment is it looks like something that needs further research. It's very interesting. probably implicated, but we still don't quite understand the mechanism of this. The idea of the T-cell exhaustion suggests viral persistence. We're starting to get lots of circumstantial evidence that points at viral persistence, and this is one of those bits of circumstantial evidence, which puts the pressure on direct studies looking for viral persistence. We want to have those as soon as possible. And that's why the work that the LCRI is doing with PolyBio is so important, and I really hope they can get somewhere, because Amy Prowell is great and they are looking in all the right places. So a little bit of patience there, hopefully. Seems like there is an exponential decay in the proportion of people with long COVID, LC post-COVID over time. There's a sharp drop-off in the first 6 months. So lots of people aren't good for 6 months and then recover at the 6-month mark. Once you get to 6 months, that dies off really quick. So as in, like, it's only a trickle of people who get better from 6 months on. So if you're a betting man, you really want to get better early, because the longer you're ill for, it does seem to take longer, but people are still recovering at every stage. And anyone feel worse after COVID vaccines? Yes, loads and loads and loads. I made films about it with data, so have a look at my YouTube channel. I've made 2 films, I think, looking at first and second rounds of COVID vaccines and how they affected symptoms, and I've got data on that. Some people feel better, but more people feel worse than feel better, especially by the time we got to the second dose. How useful do you think nattokinase is for dispersing the clots? Theoretically, yes. I can't really comment. Great. I think that's it.
Lovely. Massive thanks. And I think we'll stop the questions to allow you to go.
I'm going to go and lie down for a bit.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So thank you so much. We really look forward to reading the book and listening to it, and really appreciate this. It's a brilliant contribution to the field. Thank you, Gez.
Yeah.
And thank you,
everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope that someone has maybe just heard something that might make a 1% difference to managing their day-to-day. Because that's, what we're trying to do is help as many people as possible make whatever incremental difference they can that A, makes their days better, and B, increases the chance of recovery. So, good luck out there, everyone. Best wishes, and look after yourselves.
Thanks, Gez. Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay,
bye.
We're going to close the meeting now. So thank you very much, everyone. And yes, if you've got any other thoughts, then please feel free to email us at info@sheffieldmegroup.co.uk. And the other thing I would say is that there is a very, very massive study which you'll be aware of, Decode ME, which is looking at the genome of 25,000 people living with ME/CFS, which launched this week. And we are delighted that Professor Chris Ponting from Edinburgh is going to be talking with us on Thursday, the 6th of October. Please shout at me if I've got the wrong date. And thank you, Pippa. And so we welcome you to that talk as well. And that'll be fascinating, because that's also been modelling how to get active engagement of people who are severely and very severely affected. So we look forward to seeing you all at that talk if you can come. Please register for it.
I'm going to bust in and just give you, Carol Beattie has asked about lightning process. Super controversial. And I don't know how controversial it is in the ME/CFS community. It's super controversial in the long COVID community.
We hate it. Sorry, some of us do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same in long COVID community. But some people with long COVID say they've tried it and it really helped. So I think this is, if anything, an indication of the fact that, long COVID is multifactorial, and of those 7 causes, there will be some people who are suffering who maybe only have one of them, and maybe the changes to their life they make as a consequence of lightning process help resolve that single thing. Maybe they were going to get better anyway, who knows? But I don't think lightning process is going to eliminate virus in the gut. I don't think it's necessarily going to sort out your autoimmunity. But again, some people report good things. I can't say to people, everybody go and do the lightning process, because it's just, it's such a complex, controversial topic when we start to get into that sort of brain retraining stuff. I don't want to just kill it and say I personally hate it, because some people say I loved it, I got better, so I can't not acknowledge that. But there are lots of people who say I tried it, I spent lots of money, I didn't get better.
I think the main thing I would fall back on is I do know people who say they've got better through it or improved through it, but is that the NICE guideline now specifically doesn't recommend it, actively doesn't recommend it, the MECFS guideline. So bear in mind that you'd be making a judgment against that bit of assessed research.
Yeah. Sorry, another couple of questions. Here we go. LDN. We didn't mention LDN. Some people see some benefits from this. Some do not. There's some suggestion that some people have different types of receptors to this, and some people are more responsive to it than others. If you can get your doctor to prescribe it for you, good luck with that. But if you can, I don't know, like maybe half the people I hear saying they've taken it say it's made a significant difference. You want to roll those dice? If you can get those dice to roll, yeah, up to you. I had severe GI problems after COVID twice. Number 4, is this common? Yes. Most likely, I mean, dysautonomia and MCAS can both play absolute havoc with your gut. Yeah, pretty common. Also, COVID itself so one piece of data that was quite interesting is that of the supposed presentation of the original COVID, cough, what was it? It was cough. Can you even remember what it is now? The 3 things that told you had COVID, it was loss of smell and taste, cough, and
shortness of breath.
Shortness of breath, yeah. And of that presentation, of my sample of long haulers, rather, more people had the shivers, chills, GI upset. They had a completely different presentation that never had any of those other, or rarely had those other 3 symptoms. So that suggests that COVID in the gut, and we know that COVID infects the gut, especially during the acute infection, may play some role in the development of long COVID, and also points circumstantially at persistent virus in the gut too. So yeah, gut problems and COVID, long COVID, yeah, super common.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm going.
We can stop. Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers. All right. Thanks ever so much. Cheers, everybody. And we're going to close the meeting now. So thank you. 3rd time lucky. Okay.